tuning into episode 2 of Kentucky Running, brought to you by John's Run Walk Shop. I'm your host, Matt Reno. Last episode, we talked about injury prevention. Today, we're shifting from the physical aspects of running to the psychological. You can train your body all you want, but if you don't have the right mindset, you could be setting yourself up for disappointment. We've got a lot of good advice coming your way from University of Kentucky professor Dr. Ashley Samson of the Department of Kinesiology and Health Promotion. We'll talk about self-confidence, mindfulness, training your mind to embrace setbacks, and much more. But before we get to that, let's do a little tech talk. The Kentucky Trail Run series is happening every month at different trails in the area. During our first run in Frankfurt, I spoke with our Altra Tech rep Jordan Chance about trail shoes, plus some other things Altra has coming down the pipeline in 2024. I'm here with Jordan Chance, our Altra Tech rep, and it is the first run of the Kentucky Trail Run series. We're here at beautiful Capitol View Park in Frankfurt. It's a chilly day, but we have huge turnout. There's over 50 runners out on the trails as we speak, trying out a couple of Altra shoes that we're going to talk about in just a bit. By the way, if you want to take part in the Kentucky Trail Run series, it's absolutely free. Just go to the events page of johnsrunwalkshop.com. All right, Jordan, can you tell us about the two Altra shoes we have on the trail run today?
Absolutely. Yeah, so for this first trail run of the series, we have the Lone Peak 8 and the Temp 5. Both of these shoes came out earlier this year, 2024, and have some really awesome features. So the Lone Peak 8, this is going to have a ripstop upper, a little bit lower profile. It has Altra's signature foot shape fit, and then it has the Max Track outsole. So it's really sticky, really grippy, really tacky, just a proprietary blend of midsole from Altra. We also have the Temp. So updated in this shoe is the Vibram outsole, which is really highly coveted. Everyone loves that. A little bit extra cushioning, so just a little bit softer than this Lone Peak is going to be. Also has a ripstop upper to it, and is a little bit slimmer of a fit. So we have two really great options for everyone here. Both of these are going to give you that foot shape fit, like I said, so just a little bit roomier in the toes for natural trail running, alignment of the body, and really just full range of motion in the foot.
I'm wearing the Lone Peak 7 right now. What are some of the differences between the 7 and the 8?
Yeah, so honestly, the 7 to the 8, there's not a huge amount of changes from one shoe to the next. The primary update that you'll notice is the upper of the shoe. So like I said, it does have this newer ripstop upper, and then you'll see a lot of new colors. So that's really exciting. We got to be able to change some of those in the new update of the shoe.
So what else can we expect from Altra in 2024?
Yeah, so coming up shortly in May, we have quite a few new releases. This past year, Altra introduced its first 4mm drop shoe, and you will see this coming May. We are relaunching that shoe as well as releasing 2 new options. So you will see a trail option coming later at some of these runs. That'll be one you're able to try out and go take a test run on the trails. And we're also going to be releasing a stability option with the 4mm drop. So really the reason behind that is just to allow maybe runners who are not familiar with Altra or who want to try Altra but are scared of a zero drop, really just kind of helps break the barriers for entry and allows you to try out the shoes. Yeah, we're really excited about some of the new things coming.
That's great. We're excited to bring them to the shop too.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And again, if you're interested in taking part in the Kentucky Trail Run series, go to the events page at johnsrunwalkshop.com.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you all there.
Today we're talking with Dr. Ashley Samson, a professor in the University of Kentucky's Department of Kinesiology and Health Promotion. She's conducted research on athletes and taught courses on sports psychology and sociology. She's been sharing her insights on the mental aspects of running every month on the John's Run Walk Shop blog. Today on Kentucky Running, we're diving deeper into that topic. Ashley, it's great to have you on the show. I want to start by asking, what sparked your interest in exploring the psychological dimensions of running and athlete performance?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I love, writing those different blog posts. I have a very much personal interest in it as well as professional. So growing up myself, I was always an athlete. And then probably around junior high, I really gravitated toward running. Started running, did the normal high school track and field and cross country, and then actually went to college and got more serious about running. I was actually a competitive rower in college on our university's team, but part of our cross training, of course, was a lot of running. And so during our off seasons, we would go and run half marathons. I got into triathlons for a while. And all during that time, I was a psychology major and thought that I wanted to really pursue more of that clinical psychology, more of the traditional therapy route. But then I had a professor who, noticed my interest in sports and running in particular, and then my interest in psychology and sort of steered me towards sports psychology. And once I took the first couple classes, I realized this is absolutely what I wanted to study and what I wanted to dive into for a career. And so for myself, it's again a personal, maybe selfish interest, because I often try to think about a lot of the work that I do in my own running and apply a lot of those concepts as well. But then also I love teaching people about those concepts, because I think we all have an idea about the mental aspect of running and other sport and performance areas, but sometimes being able to put labels on it or be able to understand why my brain is doing this or why it's not doing this can sometimes be helpful then in us trying to make some adjustments to help really enhance the mental side of our performance. And specifically in running, especially long distance running, you've got lots of time to do nothing but get in your head. Once you sort of set your running pace, your body's almost on autopilot, and so your brain has all this freedom to go in all these different places that sometimes aren't always helpful. And so there's those famous quotes, we can talk ourselves into or out of anything. And especially during running, I think that comes up. And so I love being able to help people better understand what's happening with their brain. And again, then be able to make those adjustments to see the performance outcomes that they want.
How do concepts like self-efficacy and self-confidence play a role in runner success?
I think to me, and maybe I'm biased because I also research in this area, but self-efficacy and self-confidence to me, which are very similar concepts, and just to sort of clarify the distinction between the two, self-confidence is more of a global trait. And so when we think about someone who is self-confident, they're generally confident across most areas of their life, right? Some small ups and downs. And then self-efficacy is our confidence in this very moment with this task that we're doing. What is my ability to succeed, or my confidence? How successful do I think that I can be? And so I might be, let's say, generally a confident runner, but then if somebody says, okay, tomorrow we're going to do a time trial 10K, how do you feel about that? On a scale from 1 to 10, how confident are you that you can hit a certain goal time? That would be self-efficacy. And so they're very much related, but again, one's more of a global trait and one's more of a context specific in this moment for this task. How confident am I that I can be successful? And I think they're absolutely, to me, almost one of the most important factors. And when people hear about what I do for a living and they, what is the most common thing that you work with athletes on? Usually it's self-confidence can be the root of a lot of other sort of concerns that athletes might deal with. And I think, when our confidence is higher, right, we tend to interpret things very, very differently than when our confidence is lower. And so, for example, if your confidence is pretty high going into a race, but let's say maybe you get to your first couple splits and it's not quite what you want, you're like, oh, okay, I'm a little bit off. I just need to pick it up a little bit for these next few and I'll be on track. So no big deal. But if you're going into it and you're feeling unconfident, then let's say you miss that first 1 or 2 splits, then you're like, oh no, I knew I wasn't gonna be able to do this. And it sort of becomes evidence, if you will, to support that story in your head that you knew you weren't gonna do well. Right? And so then it can kind of almost become like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think also when, especially for the longer distance running, when you're really getting into some of those kind of uncomfortable spots, like when you're running a 50K, 50 mile, right? Like, it's just going to kind of generally feel uncomfortable for a while. And I just have to embrace the pain and be okay with the discomfort and know that this is just how it's going to feel. And it's not that there's anything wrong. It's like, I've run 30, 40, 50 miles. My body should be a little bit uncomfortable. And so being able to have the confidence that that it's okay and just hang with it, stick with it, coming up with different strategies. Again, one of the big things I like to work with runners on is race strategy, and not related to pacing, but related to more the mental, right? When you start to feel that discomfort, where are we going to go with our thoughts? What are we going to tell ourselves? What are our strategies going to be to help keep us focused and on track, and not start going down that rabbit hole of like, oh, this really hurts. I don't know. Can I do this? And sort of like, yes, I can do this. It's just going to be a little uncomfortable for a while, and I'm okay. I've trained for this. Those sort of things. And that goes in as well to self-efficacy. So that's actually an area that I've done a lot of research on. When I was doing my doctorate, I actually did my work in self-efficacy with marathon runners, and did a series of studies looking at a group of students. They had a really cool class at my university. It was an exercise physiology class, but the students were their own subjects. And so they trained for a marathon over the course of the semester and sort of measured the physiological changes in their body as they adapted to training. And so I was able to piggyback on that and also look at a lot of the psychological changes. And then, of course, their final exam was to go and run the Nashville Marathon, which, I was like, I'd love to take that class when I was an undergrad.
Wow, getting class credit for running.
Right.
I clearly went into the wrong field.
I know. I'm like, man, this is awesome. That was down at LSU with a wonderful, wonderful physiology professor, Laura Stewart. She's out in Colorado now. Looking at specifically as runners are training for these longer distance races, where do they get the information from to make those confidence judgments about themselves, right? And so, knowing a lot of that information, then we can sort of, back end it and say, okay, if we know that these things help make runners feel more confident, then we're going to do more of these things to help, increase that confidence and efficacy as they're going through their races. And one of the big things that comes out of that is reflecting upon your past performances, which would make sense, right? If we're trying to decide if I'm going to be successful in running this race that I've signed up for tomorrow, we're going to look back and say, okay, well, yeah, I've run this distance before. I did this other race last month and it went great, and so being able to sort of look at the past, I guess, evidence, if you will, to help shape your beliefs about your success in the future, right?
Yeah, there's that advice people give before a big race. Trust your training.
Yeah.
Don't worry too much about race day. Just remember all the work you've already put in.
Right.
Can you preempt dips in confidence during a race by adding in some realism? Like, let's say things are going well, you're hitting your goal pace, and then your energy drops a bit and you slow down. Would it help if maybe before the race you had said to yourself, okay, I'll probably have some miles that don't feel great, but I'm confident I can get through it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about I'm really big on developing race strategies. And so being able to sort of plan out, breaking races down into different sections and knowing that, okay, like these first 5 miles are going to be great. I'm going to be excited. I'm going to be, again, I'm thinking of like a trail run out in nature, loving it with everybody else. We're all going to be happy. And then we say, okay, now the second 5 miles, maybe the glitter starts to be a little bit less shiny. And so, planning ahead for that. And also, we call it, like, I know in some running circles, they say embrace the suck, right? Yeah. Like being able to know that that's coming and expect it to come. So when it comes, it's not like you're surprised and like, oh my gosh, my legs are cramping. Well, of course they're cramping. You're at mile 42. They should be, And so being able to expect that. And I think that's one thing when we think about self-efficacy is being able to properly interpret the physiological symptoms or signs that our body is giving us. And so being able to interpret that discomfort as, oh, that's normal. I should be feeling that. And so now here's my strategy to keep going through that, versus someone who maybe didn't have a strategy or wasn't really thinking that way. Perhaps that discomfort begins, those leg cramps begin, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, what's wrong? Maybe I can't do this, and they start to sort of spiral a little bit. And so, I always talk about what I call the uninvited guest that shows up to the party. And so that can be, depending on what the situation is. For a lot of athletes, it's performance anxiety. Again, when we're talking about long distance running, it can be, some of those, the doubts, the discomfort, sometimes even boredom, depending on how long the race is. If you're out there for 100 miles, that's a long time. And you start to be like, I don't even want to run anymore. I'm bored. I want to go do something else. I've been doing this for a day. And so, the unexpected guest is always going to show up to the party. And so expect that they're going to show up and just acknowledge that they show up, and then you refocus on what your strategy is. And I like to use the analogy, and maybe it's because I work with college students, I use the party analogy, but just because somebody showed up to your party doesn't mean that they have to ruin the party. Mm-hmm. It's just, they can just be that random person at the party that's just there that nobody really talks to, and that's okay. And so being able to, again, plan for that, expect that, be prepared for that. So when it happens, it's not like an, oh my gosh, what do I do about this thing? It's, I've already thought about this. Here you are, you showed up. Here's the plan I had in mind. And then it's more about just executing the plan and staying on track.
That's great advice. In your research, you cover mindfulness practice. Have you noticed any differences between runners who integrate mindfulness and those who don't?
Yeah, absolutely. So I became a certified yoga teacher probably 2014, 2015. And so I really dove into it first for my own sort of selfish personal development and all of that. But then I went, and continued down that path, and I'm a mindfulness and meditation teacher as well now. And as I really started to dive into that, I recognize that a lot of the principles are parallel to sports psychology principles. It's just branded a little bit differently. But, mindfulness has really become a huge topic in the sports psychology world, especially if you look at our big conference every year. There have been more and more mindfulness-focused presentations and workshops over the years because more of our practitioners are recognizing the place for it. And then specifically to answer your question about, athletes and runners who have mindfulness practices, I do notice a difference. Because if you think about some of the central practices of mindfulness, which is the being present, being non-judgmental, responding to situations versus reacting to situations, those are very clearly things that are going to help us just as humans in life, but especially in the performance realm, being able to stay present and avoid distractions, especially the avoiding the judgment. If you think about a runner, and as runners, stereotypically, we tend to be perfectionists, overachievers, and we like to hit our numbers and we like everything to be exactly how we like it. And so for a runner to maybe miss a couple of those splits, right? If someone who has much more of that mindfulness-based perspective, it's sort of like, okay, well, that's disappointing, but it's still fine. I can do this, and they sort of stay on track. Versus someone who maybe doesn't quite have that mindfulness headspace or that mindfulness mindset, if you will, then it's going to have a lot more of a detrimental impact, and it might be, distracting, more disappointing. There might be more negative emotions, and it might sort of turn into more of a spiral versus just like, okay, well, let me just make this adjustment and get back on track.
Yeah. So when you say non-judgment, let's say you have a split that's not the time you wanted. Instead of saying, this is terrible, I'm off track, you just say, okay, that happened, but now I'm focused on the next mile.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Okay. And one thing I like to also incorporate a lot with all athletes, but also especially, again, runners, is, avoiding the words good and bad, right? Because it's like then you're sort of putting like a valuation on the experience, which can then quickly, like if we say, oh, that was bad, right? Then it can quickly sort of take us down more of that negative emotional path versus like, it's more of an objective, like, the split was hit or it wasn't hit, that sort of thing. So then it becomes a little bit more of like a logistical, again, objective, okay, the split wasn't hit, how do we hit the split next time, right? Because then that gives you something to actually move forward with mentally versus if it's like, oh, that was bad, I didn't hit the split, what do we do with that next, right? Like that doesn't give you a thought to move forward with. And that's where a lot of times runners or even just all athletes can get stuck. Like if we make a mistake or something, and a lot of times people will talk about like ruminating on mistakes or ruminating on, a bad race. And so being able, to move past that. I always use the analogy of like a monkey, like hanging from little branches, like a little Tarzan monkey. If you don't have the next branch to grab onto, you can't let go of the one you're holding on to. Mm-hmm. And all you're going to do is just sit there and swing on this one branch and ruminate about the bad race or the bad performance. And so you've got to quickly say, okay, yes, that was disappointing. What adjustment do I need to make? And then that becomes your next, okay, now I focus on making this adjustment so I can grab the next branch and then let go of the mistake branch, if you will, that you're hanging from.
So for someone who's never put mindfulness into their running routine, how would you get started? Because this whole non-judgment thing, it's very counterintuitive to the way most of us have been taught our entire lives.
Yeah. So one thing I'll say to that first is, you're absolutely correct. I think, we sometimes don't realize we're fighting against our own brain's tendencies. The way that our brain is wired, it's wired to look at the mistakes, look at the negative, because it goes back to our caveman days, right? When we needed to pay attention to every mistake because that meant survival. I need to make sure that like what went wrong so it never goes wrong again, because next time that might mean that the tiger's gonna eat me. Whereas now we don't quite have those threats. And so I like to use the phrase, we sort of have a caveman brain in a modern day skull. So a lot of times what we're sort of fighting against is just our own brain's tendencies. And so, yeah, when you think about non-judgment and non-labeling and evaluating and putting value on things, it can seem very counterintuitive. And it doesn't mean that we all have to be sort of like running monks, who live in this enlightened space while we're running. I mean, I'll tell you, I got frustrated this morning because I felt like my run was not fast enough. But again, had to walk myself back and be like, well, you also took a month off. You did a hard yoga class yesterday. Like you're going to be a little sore and tired and fatigued. And so like, just enjoy that you're out, getting your miles in this morning, and it's a beautiful morning. And so, so again, I'm very much human, and I'm not trying to talk from this place of enlightenment whatsoever. But I think the biggest thing to get started is just the self-awareness, starting to recognize, what are you saying to yourself? What are your patterns? What are your reactions to things? Because a lot of times, again, our brain works on patterns, which is, again, how we survive. If we, wanted to sit there and think through consciously every decision that we make, we wouldn't have any time in the day. So a lot of things in our brain happen on autopilot and that are just based on patterns. And so learning to recognize those patterns that might not be as helpful for us. Just with the example this morning about sort of recognizing that I was being negative and then trying to walk myself back from that. And again, it's not that we need to necessarily go from like negative to positive and like, that first thought being like, that was a really bad run, to like, it was wonderful, because of course that's not realistic, but I like to think of going from negative to productive, right? And so moving to a more productive space. So again, maybe I was still a little disappointed that it wasn't as fast as I wanted, but I was able to say, well, no, that was still a good run. I got outside, got my miles in, and then tomorrow we'll go back at it. And so I think the biggest thing is to get started is just starting to recognize, what do I tell myself? How am I talking to myself? And especially when it starts to get uncomfortable, or I start to feel like I'm slowing down, or I'm getting tired, or I'm not hitting a split, or, I said I was going to go run 10 miles and here I am at mile 4 and I'm ready to be done. Where does my mind go during those places, right? And recognizing the patterns and the thought processes that happen. Because usually that's the first step, is if we can recognize what's happening, then we can adjust it. But if we have no awareness of where we might be getting off track, then we don't know where to start.
Excellent. Yeah. In your research, have you noticed any differences in the mental approaches between elite runners and recreational runners, and what one group can learn from the other?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, with the elite runners, they tend to be a lot more strategical, which would make sense, right? They're running at an elite level. And so they're very used to race strategy and things like that, because they're going out there with pretty hard goals to hit and places and placings and all that stuff. And it sounds kind of funny, but like with the elite runners, I'm like, just take a breath and enjoy that you get to do this, and they're like, what? And just stopping to sort of, and I don't always use the word gratitude, but to just stop and recognize that, like, you're running at this high level, you have this privilege of being able to do this thing. And so I always like to use again, I use funny phrases all the time, like, the sun's still going to rise tomorrow, right? If you don't hit this split, the sun's still going to come up tomorrow. Yeah. And so, and that's not to minimize the importance or the value or the significance of what they're doing, because absolutely, and especially if someone is doing this professionally, right? I mean, fully recognizing that this might be, part of their paycheck. But interestingly enough, the more that we focus on the process and being present and just sort of like head down in the moment, that's actually going to get you to the outcome that you want better, right? Versus the more that I focus on the outcome, the more elusive that's going to be. And so sometimes getting the elite runners to, again, this is where a lot of the mindfulness stuff can come in, because we're really trying to break a lot of those overachieving perfectionistic tendencies. I have an elite runner that I'm working with actually just started, and we were just going through a whole discussion about perfectionism and how, we're learning to sort of loosen that grip a little bit, right? And maybe we're not going to ever get to where we totally let it go. And again, that's not realistic, but we don't need to white knuckle it, right? Mm-hmm. And then for our recreational runners, I think, one thing that I talk about a lot with them is sometimes, because when we put that label of like, oh, I'm just a recreational runner, sometimes it can they can then almost put themselves in a box of like, well, so even though you're a recreational runner, you could still be fast, you could still be competitive, you just don't necessarily get paid to do it, right? Yeah. And so I think sometimes like challenging the narrative around how you quantify yourself, right? And again, putting yourself in these boxes. And then also too, sometimes they're like, oh, well, I'm just a recreational runner. I don't need to focus on, being faster or working on my mental game, even though I'd really want to. And I'm like, well, why not, right? There's a place for everyone. And that's one of the big myths in sports psychology, is they think a lot of people can think that it's only something for elite athletes. But really, I'm like, but everyone who gets out and does something athletic is an athlete, right? And so it can be beneficial to everyone.
I hear that in the shop all the time. I only run 2 miles.
Yeah, that's 2 miles more than a lot of other people.
Yeah, if you run, you're a runner. It's that simple.
No, I love it. I actually follow this page on Facebook I found a few months ago, and I love it. And it's called Slow AF Runners Club.
Yes, yeah.
And I just love it just for the inspiration. And people, like, they post their stories, and it's like, I ran my first 5K and it took me an hour, but I did it. And I just love that kind of stuff, you know, because I think people, and especially in today's culture, it's this like hustle culture, and everything has to be done at an elite level. And you have to, you know, everyone's making tons of money. And if you're going to run, you're going to run 100-miler, you know, and those kinds of things. And so sort of walking it back, and again, this idea that like, yeah, if you're out there putting one foot in front of the other, you're a runner, and you deserve applause just as much as the 100-mile runner.
Yeah, exactly. Any advice for coaches or trainers on using psychological principles with the runners that they're working with?
I think the biggest thing is recognizing that one size doesn't fit all. You know, and of course, we know that a lot with training plans as well, but also thinking from the mental aspect. I think a lot of times too, and this is where I guess, you know, people in my profession come in, is that the coach isn't necessarily burdened with being the sports psychologist as well, right? And so, you know, I think recognizing that as well, and not having to put that pressure on themselves, but also being able to infuse some of those principles just within the language that they use during training, and trying to keep things a lot more, you know, positive and productive. And again, getting to know your athletes and just preparing for what might come up. I think when working with athletes and training them for races, you know, a lot of times, again, we focus on these splits and, you know, sort of the physical strategy, but also taking some time to think about, okay, so you've got this marathon coming up, right? Let's talk about the mental side of it and making a plan for, again, first 5 miles, stay on pace, don't get too excited and go flying out the gate. Recognize all of that, take it all in, enjoy it. Second 5 miles, maybe you're going to be warmed up, things are going to start to kind of settle in, and chunk it up and kind of make that mental strategy. But having those conversations with athletes about, you know, helping them be proactive about it. Because a lot of times there will be an athlete who will come into my office who, and again, this is absolutely a role that we play, but they wait till there's a problem, then they come see us, versus being proactive about it. And I like to think about it as like strength and conditioning for your brain. You go in the weight room, you do cross training, you do all sorts of things to prepare your body for what you're going to put it through. You don't wait until you're in the race and realize, oh, I'm not strong enough, I should get stronger now, you know. And so I would like to encourage athletes to think about the mental side of things as well in that way, you know, of, okay, as I'm preparing my body, I'm also preparing my mind. And coaches can play a big part in that, in terms of just continually talking about those kinds of concepts. Again, not that they have to themselves be the sports psychologist, but just talking about, okay, as we're working on building up your speed for your tempo runs or your intervals, or working on your, you know, second half of the race strategy, let's also talk about what's happening mentally, and helping them to just start thinking about, again, and developing that self-awareness and preparing for, okay, I always know that at, you know, mile 20 of my marathon, it's going to start hurting, and that's always when I struggle. So let's think through that beforehand, so again, I'm prepared when it happens.
What are some common misconceptions people have about the psychological aspects of running?
Sometimes people can have this misperception that you have to feel amazing to have a good performance. And a lot of times then, if someone, you know, if they step up to the starting line, or let's just say the night before the race, you didn't get great sleep, because a lot of times we're in hotels or sleeping on someone's couch or wherever, right? You know, and so automatically they discount themselves, and it's like, oh, well, I didn't get my good night's sleep, or I didn't do my normal routine, or I'm a little bit late, so now I got here and I'm a little frazzled, and oh, it's not going to be a good race, right? And so you automatically just sort of put yourself in that box of, because everything wasn't perfect, or because I'm not feeling great, I can't still have a good race. Sometimes some of my best races, and some other athletes that I've worked with, some of their best performances have been when they've had like crappy lead up, you know, and it almost, you get, you know, and you get to the point where it's like, well, let's just go out and see what happens. And then your body's like, it relaxes and actually allows you to perform better.
Yeah, I once got a 10K PR on 4 hours of sleep. I don't recommend that. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying, getting a poor night's sleep might not mean you're going to have a bad race. So don't worry about it too much.
So I think learning, and this kind of circles back to the mindfulness principle of just sort of recognizing and acknowledging where you're at without placing judgment on it. Because we can, again, a lot of times we can just, have that like, oh, I don't feel very confident, so I'm automatically not going to do well, or if I feel anxious, again, there's that unexpected guest that shows up. Just because anxiety shows up, just because maybe I'm feeling a little tired or whatever, doesn't mean the party has to automatically be ruined. And so I think having more of just that open mind, and I like to think of like the possibility mindset of like, well, let's just see what happens. Maybe I still will go out and perform just fine, and that's okay, versus already deciding how the race is going to go before you even take off.
Yeah. Looking ahead, what areas of research do you think hold the most promise for advancing our understanding of the psychological dimensions of running?
I definitely think, continuing to increase the implications and applications of mindfulness, certainly. I think also, there's been a lot of really good work lately highlighting the benefits of mental health from running, but also how mental health can impact our running as well. And so looking at it sort of from both sides of the coin, if you will, like running can help improve a lot of mental health, concerns that we might deal with, but then also recognizing that certain mental health concerns can impact running performance and learning how to adjust and accommodate around those. I think, that, again, and that's becoming talked about more and more as we're starting to sort of decrease the stigma around talking about those kind of things, because it wasn't until probably like 5, 6, 7 years ago, Kevin Love's article sort of burst upon the scene, and it got us really talking about mental health in athletes, and then Simone Biles and all of that, and more conversations are being had. So I of course, in my profession, love that we're talking about that stuff more. And I think too, a lot, as specifically ultra running has become more and more popular, and more people are wanting to really sort of hit those, 100, 200 mile mark. I think there's a lot more research to be done in those areas. I had one of my graduate students when I was out in California, we did some research looking at runners who were running one of the 100 milers out there, and we actually mic'd them up for, I think it was miles 80 to 95, to sort of see, because in ultra running, that's about sort of like the wall, if you will, like mile 20 for the marathon, mile 80 is like the wall for the 100. And so we mic'd them up and had them actually sort of talking out loud while they were running, like what were they thinking about, what were their strategies, and just sort of where were they at mentally to sort of capture it happening in real time. And so I definitely think there's some more work to be done there as we help to better understand it. So then, of course, we can help other athletes as well.
Yeah, I know an ultra runner who's had hallucinations on the course.
Yeah, I paced one of my girlfriends at Leadville years ago, and at 3 a.m, I had to hold her hand to keep her from wanting to stop and go back and help the person who was sitting on the rock, which there was no person sitting on a rock. And so I promised her we would come back to him after we finished the race. We'll come back to him. Promise he'll still be there. And so that was fun.
Wow, that's wild. Now, talking about mental health, I've seen on social media people post things that say running is my therapy, and I'm like, well, I'm glad running helps you feel better mentally, but if you need therapy, you should probably see a real therapist. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. No, I 100% agree. I don't think that it should be a replacement for therapy, by no means. However, it can be a very powerful sort of addition to. There's actually some really cool research that's come out that's shown when we look at the impacts of therapy combined with some sort of aerobic activity, most of the time it's sort of running and walking, versus therapy and medication, that it can have very similar impacts in terms of specifically depression and anxiety, which I think is huge, right? That we can see that, the impacts of running can have similar effects as medication. That's not to say if you need medication, you should just get off your medication and start running. I will throw that caveat out very strongly. There certainly is a place for medication, and I'm highly supportive of anyone who needs it. But it can be a nice, sort of augmentation of that as well. And so, there's also some research to show that the repetitive motion of running can be psychologically soothing to us on a very sort of subconscious level. And so just that repetitive motion, if you think about like when a baby cries, we're going to pick them up, we're going to bounce them, we're going to rock them, right? So it's these sort of repetitive whole body motions. And so running also fits into that. And so, a lot of times when people say, like, if you're anxious, go take a walk, there's actual legitimate research to support the physiological sort of changes that can happen as a result of that. And, running is sport, of course, especially. And so, I wholeheartedly agree with people using running as sort of something to help with mental health or stress or things like that. But again, as an addition to therapeutic work, for sure.
Yes, great points. Well, as we wrap up, I want to ask, what resources or further reading would you recommend for listeners interested in delving deeper into the psychological aspects of running?
Yeah, well, if you're local to Lexington, you're more than welcome to come pop into one of my courses, and listen in anytime you want. But I would say two of my favorite books are The Mindful Athlete by George Mumford. I'm not sure if you're familiar with who that is, but he is a mindfulness coach who worked with the Bulls during all the Jordan years. He's worked with the Clippers, the Lakers, the Kobes, the Shaqs. He's worked with all of those athletes, and really talks about just being mindful and being an athlete and how they can coexist, especially, in some of our sports where it can be very like power, performance, macho kind of thing. And I love the way that he writes. I mean, there's like F-bombs in the book and all of that. So it's a very conversational, good read. My other personal favorite that I've been recommending to everyone, it's a couple years old now, is Emotional Agility by Dr. Susan David. And she talks a lot about, because in our current culture, we're very much about like positivity and good vibes only and all this sorts of stuff. And it's actually been now coined toxic positivity. And because what happens is when you try to just be positive all the time, you actually sort of minimize and invalidate your actual feelings, right? If you're having a negative emotion, we need to acknowledge that emotion and also recognize that it's trying to tell us something. Versus like, no, it's fine. Just put your smile on and everything's great. That's actually going to be worse for you in the long run. And so she really dives into the science behind all of that. But then she also gives some really good strategies for how to sort of recognize those uncomfortable emotions, be able to sit with them a little bit, and then sort of start to explore. And she says like emotions are data points, right? And so what's the data trying to tell us? Right? And so this idea of if I'm having this negative emotion, there's a reason for it. Let me stop and figure out maybe why I'm feeling this negative emotion versus trying to just stamp it down and be positive. Mm-hmm. Now that I'm saying this out loud, I think about this in terms of paralleling that with running, learning to sit with discomfort and not trying to fight it, So I think, there's some good parallels there for runners as well.
All right, last question. You moved to Kentucky from California. So what are some of your favorite running spots in Kentucky?
So far, I'm in love with the Gorge, I will say. I really am loving the Gorge. And I've been trying to go out and explore. As I mentioned earlier, I did a 50K last month, so I was going out to the Gorge on the weekends to do my long runs. And so I tried to pick a different trail every week to explore. Sometimes it didn't work out as well as I thought when certain trees were down or flooding and things like that. But yeah, the Gorge is probably my favorite spot. And then just here in town on a daily basis, I actually live right around the corner from the shop. So running around just the neighborhoods there, and especially now that we're getting into spring and it's nice. The Arboretum is really nice. And so, yeah, and anytime I can just get out into the woods, so even driving up to Stamping Ground to like the mountain bike trail up there, for me, anytime I can get into the woods, I'm happy.
All right. That's awesome. Ashley, you've given us a ton of valuable advice. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That was a great conversation. Ashley offered a ton of excellent information about the mental side of running. If you want more of her insights and advice, check out the blog at johnsrunwalkshop.com. She provides a guest article at the beginning of every month. The latest article covers the practice of visualization. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure you rate, review, subscribe. That's going to help other people find the show, and it gets advice like what we covered today out to more runners. On our next episode, we're going to learn about an organization that breathes new life into beat-up old sneakers. Don't miss it. For John's Run Walk Shop, I'm Matt Reno. We'll talk again soon on Kentucky Running.